and get started. We're a relatively small group today, about a dozen of you. So let's keep it pretty informal. If you have a question, come off mute and ask it, or put it in the chat box, or, just generally wave and signal, and we can stop and, talk things through as we go along. All right. So this is our advert about C4 Innovations. You should know all about it. I believe that I'm either number 5 or number 6 in the webinars, so I won't go through that today. So after this session, you'll be able to understand why Housing First is one of many effective approaches to addressing homelessness, be able to think practically about it and how you use it, and articulate how you implement Housing First in your work. Think of it as, in conjunction with equity. So, what is Housing First? Can one of you tell me? Just put it in the chat, come off mute. In fact, let's make it more than one. Let's make it a few of you. Tell me what your first impressions are of Housing First, or how you define Housing First. Okay, Karen says a services program. Interesting. What about others? And the philosophy. Good point.
I wanted to answer. My name is Damaris. Hi.
Hi, Damaris.
I wanted to say that Housing First is prioritizing their living situation or shelter above any other barriers.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, Mayor, housing people first, then work on other barriers. Okay. We're going to have to work on the audience participation a bit, but we'll move on for now. But there will be plenty of other times for you to jump in. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing your perspectives on things. So what is Housing First? Okay, well, we know that it's an evidence-based practice. It has been proven. There's a whole body of research around it. That SAMHSA doesn't just name things as evidence-based practices without that body of research. Some claim that it's the most effective approach to ending chronic homelessness. And as somebody put in the chat and, just said, as part of the webinar, it offers individuals and families experiencing homelessness immediate access to affordable or supportive housing. One thing that we don't really examine is the types of different models of Housing First. So I've thrown up the NIH definition of Housing First. It's several years old, they just say we prioritize permanent housing to people experiencing homelessness that ends their homelessness and serves as a platform to pursue personal goals and improve quality of life. I like that definition because I find it very aspirational. But when we look at Housing First, it's, not everyone defines it in the same way, and not everyone who practices Housing First defines it in the same way. So if you look at, Sam Sembaris's model of pathways to housing, you will see things like ACT teams, or in more rural areas, intensive case management, and they have a very holistic approach to the support that they give people in their properties. You go across the nation and you go to DSC, and, they have a slightly different model. You go down to Colorado and they have a slightly different model. My challenge to you today, even if you just switch off, scroll social media for the next hour and 20 minutes, is to think about what your model is, and to think about what Rhode Island's model is, and what Rhode Island values, and, and the way they implement Housing First within that. So the key issue is not to get bogged down in this, but to understand the principles and adapt them to the way that your agency, your community, your coordinated entry, your COC does it. And the last thing I say is that sometimes over the last 10, 12 years, we've tried to treat Housing First almost as a religion. You have to do everything in the same way, and it's the way that I'm telling you to do that. And I want to make 2 points. It's a great way to end homelessness. It's not the only way to end homelessness. I work a lot in recovery housing, and they have a contrasting set of principles. Depending on who the person is, they may be better off using a housing first approach or a recovery based approach. All I'm saying is that if you apply the basic principles and use fidelity in your housing first approach while recognizing that your community will, to a certain extent, personalize it, you have an excellent way of ending homelessness. Doesn't mean it's the only way to end homelessness, and that it's not a one size fits all. Okay. So let's start with a poll, shall we? Thank you, Caroline. So how familiar are you with the housing first and the principles within it? So go ahead and answer that poll for me, please. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I will end the poll and share the results with you. Okay, so very few of you are unfamiliar with housing first, so that's great. A couple of you are saying, I understand how it works, but we don't particularly use it. So hopefully, we can talk a little bit about what's preventing that. We use some of the principles is our most popular answer, and I have a deep understanding of how it works, and I practice it as part of my role. Okay, so for those of you who say that, my goal will be to try and think about it with you in a slightly different way, or, give you a refresher, or just kind of try and, keep your interest enough by my feelings on the subject so that you get something from the training. Okay. Close that out and go to links. Okay, so why housing first? And I think it's worth grounding ourselves in this slide. And I mean, this is 20 years old, this research. So it was 2004. But it had an approximately 80% housing retention rate, which when that happened, that was a profound challenge to all of us. Because we had that overwhelming feeling of, well, people aren't ready for it, so we shouldn't do it. And thank you, Karen, that you had a 95% success rate. That's brilliant. And it shows that for many people, it works in a comprehensive way. Like I said, doesn't work for, it's not 100%. Rhode Island had 95%. When they did this original seminal study, that was 80%. So, we get caught up in the idea that it will work for everyone. And that isn't necessarily the case. Those of you who have been doing case management for a long time can probably attest to. So I want to start by telling you a little bit about my first experience with Housing First. And I was what we called, a resettlement worker in London, England, quite a while ago. And, I first met Martin because he was on the streets. Martin had quite a long psychiatric history. He had a substance use issue. He had a spotty employment record. He had, had a long history of challenges. And so he had ended up on the streets. And when I first met Martin, I asked him why he wasn't in a shelter. And he said, I just don't feel safe there. And he wanted an apartment. And I disagreed with him, frankly. I felt that his challenges were too comprehensive to just place him straight from the streets into his own apartment. Martin disagreed, and so I took it to my supervisor, and luckily for Martin, my supervisor agreed with him and not me. And so we put Martin forward for housing, and he stayed on the streets until he was ready. And when the time came, he moved in, and he thrived, did really well. He avoided some of those challenges that often people have, when they feel guilty, so they invite some of their friends to come and stay with them, and things just all get chaotic. Or, he didn't come home after getting drunk and, turn his music up loud at 3 a.m. and play the Irish Rover over and over again. He avoided all of those obvious pitfalls that sometimes happen. And he just, he quietly got on with his life, and he would stay in his apartment. And I would go and visit him every Friday afternoon, and I would bring coffee, and we would sit and we would just talk and, find out how things were going. And so, Martin had an apartment which led off a hallway. And so, the first few weeks when I went in every Friday, I would see this stack of letters. And this stack of letters would just be sitting there. And I said, "Oh, Martin, what's that?" And he said, "Oh, don't worry about that. I'll get to that. It will be, it's just for the last tenant." And I was like, "Okay." And so carried on. And then several weeks later, I noticed the stack of letters is getting bigger. So I was like, "Martin, look, why don't I just take these with me when I go?" He's like, "No, I don't need you to. This is my house, my apartment. I've got this." And I'm like, "Okay." And so a few more weeks go by, and I don't know what it's like in America, but in England, when things are getting tight, you start getting letters that are marked in red. And I looked down and saw a lot of letters that were marked in red, which generally meant that you were about to be cut off, or you were about to be evicted, or your services were about to be disconnected. And so I looked down and I realized that they were all for Martin. And so I said, "Martin, what's going on? You haven't even been opening these." And he looked at me and said, "I just can't. I can't do it." And now, of course, now looking back, it was obvious that, Martin was suffering from some type of trauma or PTSD that, just meant that he had this challenge. And so I picked up the letters, and, we walked into his apartment and I started opening them. Things were bad. And so I said, "Martin, what are we going to do?" And he's just like, I can't deal with that." And so I said, "Well, look, do I have your permission to take these to the office and sit down and go through these and do with them what I can?" And he was like, "Yeah." So I left, and I spent the afternoon going through all the letters and making calls and, begging and making payment plans and asking for additional chances. And things were bad. He was about to be evicted. So Monday morning, I go back to Martin, and we both sit there looking embarrassed. And he was embarrassed because he was ashamed of the situation. And I was embarrassed because I was ashamed that I hadn't realized this and that it was literally my job to prevent this. And so after we talked about that a lot, we started to sit down and make a plan. And so for a while, I would just gather up the letters once a week. And then for a while, I would gather them up and I would read them out to him. And then for a while, we would divide them in two. And he would read out half to me, and I would read out the other half, and then we would make a plan on what we were going to do with them. And then after a while, he just started doing it himself, and it never really came up again. And that, to me, feels like housing first, where really the housing is 10% of the case management that you're going to do. The 90%, and this, let me be really clear, this is a relatively minor issue that case managers have on a day-to-day basis. But I was so convinced that everything was going fine that I had convinced myself that finding the housing was 90% of the job. And finding the housing is 10% of the job. And then the services that we wrap around people make the full, the bulk of the work that we will end up doing. And that, to me, feels like housing first in a nutshell. So this isn't a race equity training, but I want to just be real clear because we will touch on race equity. couple of times during this presentation. And I just want to make two statements around this so that when we look at it again, we understand why this ties into housing first. And what we know, Black, Indigenous, and people of color experience homelessness at disproportionately high rates, and they are impacted by systemic, institutional, and interpersonal racism that are infused within our housing system, with every other system within the USA. And so when I touch on race equity throughout the presentation, those are the two statements that I go back to. So, housing first. You can read a dozen different books and see a dozen different focuses. Here is my favorite. This is Housing First in Canada. It's Gates, Scott, and Gulliver. It's up online in the Homeless Hub. I can provide copies. It all started with the research around chez soi. I like this because it's straightforward. I also like it because the Canadians spell things correctly. And it's just something that I feel like if you can grasp these 5 principles, it's fairly straightforward to manage your housing first. So let's start with the first one. That's immediate access to housing with no housing readiness requirements. And I want you to stop and think a little bit about what does the person need to get into your project, but more importantly, what keeps someone from being accepted or receiving or making it all the way through your project. And we can all point to the people that we are successful with, and we should be very proud of those. But those aren't the people that I want to consider. I want us to consider, what does a person, who are the people who don't make it through? And one of the ways we can consider that is by, looking at our eligibility criteria and saying, which of those are federal eligibility criteria? Which of those agency-based criteria? Which of those are COC-based criteria? And the thing to think about is that federal and COC eligibility criteria are usually pretty simple and straightforward, and just a few of them. And then we build on top of that. And sometimes, we build on top of that for good reason, but sometimes we build on top of that because that is the way that we as staff think. Karen, that's a really good point. I also have Samson Barris's Housing First manual, and while I was doing Housing First in England, he codified a lot of thoughts that I had about that into that one book. It's a great manual if you want to spend time thinking about your philosophy and your principles around Housing First. So, thank you. So, as I said, we should be screening people in or out. So what are eligibility criteria? And which of these are federal or COC? Have you tested your eligibility and your admission criteria to determine who doesn't make it through the system? And I wanted us to take a moment. I don't want to, if we were doing 2 days, we'd spend a lot longer on this. But I wanted you to take a moment and think about an eligibility criteria, either in your agency or in an agency you've worked for, or in an agency that and think about an eligibility, a piece of eligibility criteria that you think, I'm not sure that helps people get through the system. And I'll give you an example. When I lived in Atlanta, there's a transitional housing program that wasn't too far from me. 3 of their criteria were, you had to have been sober for 10 months. You had to have a job, and you had to have a car. Now, unsurprisingly, that transitional housing program was never full. There were beds available every night because they had a list of eligibility criteria that, frankly, were there for the convenience of the staff rather than to serve the population that they should have been serving. So I want you to consider that, take a moment, you can put it in the chat box, you can come off mute and think about an eligibility criteria that you have seen that you do, that you would say, I don't think that's a helpful thing for our clients. Thank you, Karen. Strong start there. Criteria not helpful. Mental health compliance, taking meds. Nowhere in the COC or the federal guidelines will you see that in any housing or homelessness program, but it's one we often have. Who else has something? Not using substances. We're supposed to be a harm reduction model. That's a really good point. Come on, everyone else. Don't let Karen be the sole representative of Rhode Island. No incarceration history. Dion, that's an excellent one. Being willing to sign paperwork. Yep. Identifying documents needed up front. That's a really good point there, Sandra. Yes. Nowhere will you see in any COC or federal criteria that you need an ID. Now, at some point, if you want a landlord, if you're in a rapid rehousing program, they're going to want to see some ID. But, for a shelter, transitional housing, or, often a lot of places, we do not need ID. So why do we ask for it? Okay. The one, I always suggest that people sit down within their agencies and their programs and think about who makes it through, who makes the decision as to whether someone who makes it through. And our decision makers are, able to own that they, like everyone else, have internal biases. Does the system own that some folks will find it harder to make it through the system because of behavioral issues, and also because of race, because of gender, because of sexuality? We all have prejudices. Some of them, we are self-aware. Some of them, we are not self-aware. And so we need to depersonalize admission criteria. And one of the ways to do that is to track who is successful and who isn't. We all have HMIS. I know that it's every person's dream to spend their time entering HMIS data. Not really. None of us went into this work to enter HMIS data, but it's there. And so let's use it. Let's make sure, that the folks that we lead through our system are the same, match the demographics of the folks that are on the streets. And, that's a worthwhile way of looking to see whether we are holding any biases, and whether the agency is holding any biases, whether, usually without being self-aware of it. So if the decision makers are individuals who get to pick who gets a housing solution or decide on the principles and rules that determine who makes it through the system, then they may be influenced by internal biases. And how do we ensure that people who represent the people that can't get through the system get to decide on system principles? And we do that by building up relationships and systems that listen to the people with lived experience. Okay, so does anyone have any questions or points to make, that first principle around low barrier entry? One of the things I often encourage agencies to do is sit down once a year and go through every single eligibility criteria that they have, and then decide whether they still want to keep that, whether that's for the benefit of the residents and potential residents, or for the benefit of the staff, and whether they should keep that. And once you've done that, sit down and think about the unofficial rules, the custom and practice. It may not say we don't let people in after 10 p.m., but you may have, no staff on at that point. So you may only have security there during that time. And so that's worth sitting down and considering, do we need to make a change so that the folks that would normally be night owls can get in? Anyone got any points to make? All right, let's move on to our second point, consumer choice and self-determination. So another case management story around, this is based in Atlanta, and I was a case manager a number of years ago, and I was based at a shelter in the center of downtown Atlanta. And when I first met Robert felt like he was going to be the easiest person I had case managed in years. He was articulate, he was together, he was on time, he would, be super responsive to anything I asked him for. He was open and honest. And, we spent a number of weeks just going through the assessment forms, and we would sit down and, talk things, I would talk about, what I needed from him, and he was great. And, we're about 4 weeks, 4 or 5 sessions into this. And I said, Robert, I don't think your time at the shelter is going to be very long. We have a great new program called Rapid Rehousing. And I want you to, be one of the first people to ever get through our rapid rehousing system. And, we can sit down, we can fill out the paperwork, we can go through it all. And it pays your rent for up to 2 years. It pays your utilities for up to 2 years. We will find you a landlord. It's going to be so cool. And Robert looked at me and said, well, that's not what I want. And I said, okay, I'm clearly not explaining it very well. Did I mention 2 years rent-free, utilities, a case manager to help you with, finding work and all that good stuff? This is going to be great. And he was like, no, you're not hearing me. That's not what I want. And I said, well, what do you want, Robert, if you don't want that? And he said, I want this. And, it wasn't that picture, but it was a similar thing. He said, I want a fixer-upper. My whole family's been in construction for many years. I'm going to buy a piece of land. You need to buy me a piece of land. We're going to refurbish a house. I'm going to live there for the rest of my life. And I was like, well, Robert, I can't do that. That's not possible. Let's talk about some realistic expectations, and let's talk about you renting from a landlord. And he looked at me and said, I've been listening to you for over a month. Every week, I've told you things that I wouldn't tell my family. I've told you things that I wouldn't tell my friends. I've filled in your stupid assessment form. I have gone through everything. And now at the end, you're just going to tell me, yeah, you're not going to help me. Well, and he just walked out. And so I spent a bit of time sitting there. And then the following day, I decided to go and look for him. And I found him in my manager's office filling out a complaint form about me. And so I sat down with him and said, look, by all means, fill in a complaint form. I probably deserve that. I definitely deserve that. But I probably deserve that. But let's try to find a way forward. And, we sat down, and for the first time, I listened and he did most of the talking. And, we genuinely tried to find a way forward. And in the end, he ended up going through rapid rehousing, but he also got involved in Habitat for Humanity around building houses. And the last time I spoke with him, he was talking about being able to work on a house within that organization and get housing. And what I learned from that is that I was very overconfident in my opinions and my impressions and my judgment, and that was a good example of I had the power within the system. I was the case manager. I'd made a decision on what was going to be the best thing for Robert. Robert profoundly disagreed with me and called me out on it. So if we own that because of our role in the system, we have the potential to, act on biases, as I mentioned earlier, and that we need to make a conscious effort to share the control and to give control over the process to the person that it impacts the most. In Robert's case, this was about ensuring that he got a say in, in the type of housing that he wanted, that he followed a process where he could make a decision based on what was available, so that he felt like he was making the decision rather than me making the decision. And so we want to sit down and offer and discuss and make available as much as we can. I mean, we have to stay within realistic, boundaries, a menu of choices in terms of housing location, style, and type of housing. Now, I would like a penthouse in Manhattan, and that won't happen in this lifetime. So we need to be realistic in what we want. But we also need to be realistic in understanding that my ideas around success are very different to Robert's ideas around success. And that just because I wanted Robert to be out of the shelter as fast as possible, I wasn't letting Robert set the pace of any work that Robert wanted to, anything that Robert wanted to work on. And so I needed to understand that I needed to take a back seat and allow Robert to make to start the journey and support Robert rather than tell him where to go. So Karen makes a point, a great example of why the foundation of Housing First is to ask, what does the client want and how I can help? Yes, good example of me not doing that and being taught by the client to do that. But I want to ask you, and we can put it in the chat box, you can come off mute. What do you think, what do you often, what do your clients tell you that success looks like for them? And you can think about that in the short term, or you can think about that in the long term. But when a client talks to you about success, what are they thinking about? To give you a couple of examples, I've had clients who have said, success for me today is, to get through the day without scoring or, without taking whatever the drug of their choice was. Equally, success for me means reconciling with my family and living back in that community. What are some of the things that you hear from clients about what their perception of success is? Nice, Damaris. Yes, finding employment. Yeah, getting in touch with family. It's amazing how so many people lose the touch with their family. And I was out doing interviews with people with lived experience in another state last week, and hearing every single one of them at some point during the interview said, I want to reconcile with my children, with my parents, with my siblings. One of those. Finding stable and affordable housing, getting their own place. Yes. Yeah, so many of us want to do that. Having a place to live and to use that stability to gain employment and gain custody of their child. That's another big one. Thank you, Zach. Not live in a shelter. Yeah. Okay, so as we think about, what does success mean to our clients and how they can set the pace of moving along and, making choices, realistic choices. Let's move on to our third principle, which is a recovery orientation. So we're not just thinking about basic client needs. We're often thinking about that, but we're not just thinking about that. But we need to support recovery that people may be moving through. And so if we have a recovery orientation that focuses on individual well-being and ensures that people have a range of supports to nurture them and move them forward at their pace. So I love SAMHSA's definition of recovery. I know that in some ways it's still controversial, but to me, it's the lack of absolutes in this definition that makes me happy. Other people that I've met in recovery hate this because of the lack of absolutes. But when we look at it, we hear a process. We haven't finished the journey where it's a process of change through which individuals improve. Again, the lack of the absolute. It's where people are improving their health and wellness. They live a self-directed life and they strive to reach their full potential. Often we think in terms of beginning and end. And this definition doesn't go there. It talks about a journey, which is, what so many of us are on. And so as we think about that, and we think about harm reduction, which we'll come on to in a moment, we know that there's a process of change. We know that that journey is what people, are on as we move them through the homeless response system. And so when we think about housing first and recovery, we want to focus on individual well-being. We want open and honest conversation. We want to build that relationship and then promote trust within that relationship, because all of those will strengthen the recovery process. So within our recovery approach, Housing First uses a harm reduction model in its work on a day-to-day basis. So let's talk a little bit about Housing First. So how many of you are using, and you can do this with a thumbs up or a reaction, thumbs up or a raised hand or whatever, but how many of you are using reduction as part of your work on a day-to-day basis? Okay, I'm seeing one so far. Okay, now we're coming. Yes, we've got a few more here. Yes. Okay. All right. Thank you. A good number of you. How many of you are using as part of your, use harm reduction in your personal life on a day-to-day basis? Okay, few of you, not so many. Okay, I want us to sit down and think about harm reduction in a new way. I'm going to finish this webinar and then I'm going to go and meet a friend for lunch. And I live in the countryside. So I will jump into my car, I will start the engine, and then what's the first thing I will do? I will put my seatbelt on. Why? Well, apart from the fact that, my driver's license can't take another ticket, it's the fact that it's going to reduce harm. It's a safety issue. And so that in itself is just a perfect example of what harm reduction is. You put a seatbelt on because you want to reduce the amount of harm. And we do this hundreds of times a day. We all make harm reduction decisions around day-to-day lives. When we do this, we don't even consider it. And yet somehow when we apply it to our work and risky behavior, it becomes a much bigger thing and a much more controversial thing. So what is harm reduction? This is an old definition from the Harm Reduction Coalition. They have updated it since. But I love this definition, so I am resisting the urge to update this slide to that, because I love the way that it just gives us that spectrum. So it's reducing negative consequences of drug use or any form of risky behavior, incorporating a spectrum of strategies from safe use to managed use to abstinence. Harm reduction strategies meet people where they're at and address conditions of use along with the use itself. That just feels like it's such an all-encompassing definition that it takes people where they're at, which could be at any one of those points. So we talked a little bit about how we make our decisions and how we make harm reduction decisions. But I want to take one stage further and say, these are, firstly, they are highly contextual and, what we consider safe these days, people didn't consider, so for example, my mother used to smoke when I was a baby and would smoke a cigarette in one hand and hold me in the other. We don't do that anymore. Why don't we do that anymore? Because we know it's harmful. And we as a society have broadly agreed that we don't, that that's not a good idea. And there's often a lot of, peer pressure around doing that. But they're also, because, we also make these decisions where we decide to indulge in risky behavior. So, for example, we may decide to, when I'm going out to lunch, I may decide that I am tired of salads. I've eaten salads all through the summer and I am sick and tired of them. And I want the burger and fries. Now, I know that's not good for my high blood pressure. Frankly, I'm going to salt the fries. But I know that I have made considerable progress in not eating burger and fries for the last 3 months. And that just deciding to do it once is very unlikely to have a negative consequence. So we make those decisions constantly. We think, hang on a minute, is that a risky scenario? Yes. Am I willing to do that? Now, I might decide I'm only going 100 yards down the road. I'm not going to put my seatbelt on there because the risk is low. The consequences would be high, but the risk is low. And so we make these decisions in our heads constantly around, I'm going to reduce harm or I'm going to take the risk. And we need to understand that our clients all do the same all the time. So what do? We offer harm reduction. So that's a menu of services, resources that support incremental progress. Remember that? Going back to that definition around recovery, we're now thinking about incremental progress. It's rare, I'm not saying it never happens, but it's rare that change happens immediately. So we need to consider, how we can be compassionate and pragmatic, that, we're dealing with some complex behaviors and that any form of risky behavior will have some aspects of it, some methods that are safer than others, and that we need to gently encourage people to move towards safer behavior. But that we need to recognize that the client has the decision, makes the decisions around this. So, control is something that we need to think about all the time when we come and we consider housing first, whether that's that low barrier entry with control and who controls the gateway for people to get in. When housing choice, who controls that and how do it? And now we need to think about control in terms of recovery. People have the right to make decisions about their lives and actions. And we can broaden and make more choices available to people so that they have the right. They also have the responsibility. Let's make no bones about that. We want them to have the right to do things, but they also need to, if they have the right to do it, they also have to be responsible in doing it. So how do we do that? We don't use stigmatizing and condoning and condemning language when we talk about things. We let people take their responsibility and we allow them to think about their own goals and to set the pace and make the choices around that. So when we think about risky behavior and harm reduction, we don't punish people for making what we consider the wrong choice. We are supportive, we are gently encouraging, we can, try and make sure that the menu of options is available. But we don't punish, because why? When we create punitive sanctions, people lie. I lie, you lie, we all lie. I went to see my primary care physician about 3 weeks ago. I told the truth twice during that entire visit. I told him my name, and that was correct. And I told him my date of birth, and that was correct too. If I could have lied on my date of birth, I'd probably have done that. But everything else was pretty much me putting the best possible spin on it. Why? because one, I felt like I would experience shame if I told the truth for the answers. Two, there could be consequences. There would be a written record of those things. It could impact my insurance down the line. I didn't want to tell the truth. So when my physician asked me how much I drank, I told her hardly ever. I maybe have one beer on a Saturday night. That's it, no more. When she asked about how much I exercised, I told her almost every day. Walking, swimming, running, lifting weights. Now, I'm sure she can see that I wasn't telling the truth, because anyone who'd met me for 30 seconds is going to notice that I'm not telling the truth. But I'm telling lies because I am worried about the consequences. So do our clients. If we can give them a space where telling the truth means that positive things happen, people are much more likely to tell the truth. Not exclusively, not every time, because people are worried about the consequences of that. But when we consider that, giving them a space to be truthful, they are more likely to. And so we don't do punitive sanctions. We don't do, negative consequences. We recognize that people want incremental change, and that we use a quality of life measurement rather than anything else. So how does that contrast? So often our services first approach meant that people had to come to us. Often abstinence was the only way. And that abstinence, was equated to success. If you were abstinent, you were succeeding. That 12-step support program. Now, don't get me wrong, I have many friends and many families members in recovery who have used 12 steps successfully. Huge fan. If that's your jam, if that's your thing, then I love it. And I've seen, great success. But what I'm saying is that we shouldn't make it the only way. We should take Samson's approach of many pathways to recovery. And it's kind of focused on we need to fix the problems. When we use a harm reduction approach, we're engaging, we're meeting people halfway, we're walking alongside them. We're acknowledging that it doesn't have to be abstinence. It can be, there are positive effects to a reduction of use. We're offering support options, and we're solutions focused rather than focusing on the problems. Usually, when I'm doing this face-to-face, about now, somebody whose brain is about to explode will say, so it's a free-for-all then. They can do anything they like. And I remind people that, firstly, none of us can do anything we like, but we all have a level of freedom to be able to do that. We take the rights for it, we take the responsibility for it, but that we do not tolerate people creating dangerous environments for themselves, for ourselves, for the people around them. Now, that's a very easy thing to say and a really hard thing to assess, because everyone's ideas around are slightly different. And so that's another good example, along with the low barrier entries, on how people should think about that as an organization, as a community. Where are the lines drawn? And are they always drawn like that for the same people? So we don't tolerate dangerous environments. We have a duty to do some self-care and to keep ourselves in positive situations while still ensuring that people, while people, are able to make decisions about their own lives. So that's kind of a long one. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions? Harm reduction is something that's, frankly, controversial these days. Does anyone have any thoughts around, how they do that as part of their day-to-day work? Karen, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to add that here with the Housing First here in Rhode Island, there's really only two requirements. One is that the person lives by the lease, And second, that they agree to a weekly meeting in the beginning. That could
Yeah.
change. So, like you were saying, like someone could choose to keep using, and we know that's maybe not going to work out well. But it's like you said, it's not a free for all. It's like you get to live your life, and there's as it is for all of
Yeah.
us. There's consequences when we make bad decisions, right? And that's
Yes.
what
Yes.
housing first. It's like no different than the rest of us live, right? So anyway.
Yes, one of the biggest things in my life that I had to learn is that I have the right to do a lot of things, but not all things are useful for me to do them. And you're exactly right, Karen. Thank you. Anyone else got any points to make? Okay. All right. Well, we're into the last, we've got two more principles that I want to talk about. So individualized client-driven principles. So this isn't rocket science, but particularly based on what we've talked about over the last hour. But under a housing first model, all supportive services should be voluntary. We don't want to do a one size fits all. That's not good case management. We want to make sure that anything we do is individualized, is useful, is agreed with the clients. And so, that they have the power to decide on it, to set the pace, and to decide what success looks like. So different styles of housing first, have, as Karen just mentioned, you have to adhere to the lease, and you have to have an initial visit, at least towards the start of your time there. And that's personally exactly the way I think. I know that there are housing first programs where you don't have to have that visit. I'm too type A to be comfortable with that. And you would be right in saying, Jonathan, well, didn't you just say that the client gets to make the choices? And I would agree with you. And all services are voluntary, but this is just the way. And so housing first, a lot of housing first programs do say any potential visit to your home, you don't have to be there, but I'm going to do it. I personally like the way that Karen outlined, where you have to be at least initially there for a visit. So, but it's certainly worth thinking about when we think about accepting or offering services. And and I know I've talked about how we don't get to choose. People have the right, people take the responsibilities. That doesn't mean we should ever stop offering services. And one thing I've always said is that, because this happened to me once, when a client saw me walking down the street and they were walking towards me in the opposite direction, walking towards me, and they saw me and immediately turned around and started heading the other way, I realized at that point, maybe I had offered services one too many times to that person, or maybe I've been a bit dogmatic. I'm giving you permission that until somebody starts running away from you, you should still be offering services to that person. They don't have to accept it, but you can still offer it. You can tell them of all the positive things that will happen if they accept that service. You can tell them, the challenges that will be involved in that. But we need to make sure that we continue to offer services while we're their case manager. Okay. So, and I want to touch on biases when accepting or offering services. And you can feel free to put some of these in the chat box, but why do we think that, some individuals that include Black, Indigenous, and people of color have a lower uptake on mental health services, substance use services, physical health services, other kinds of services? Why do we think that sometimes people of color may struggle, may have a lower uptake on these services? Let's put some ideas in the chat box, or you can come off mute. Okay, we've got a quick couple in here already because they've been used against them. Exactly, yes. Then Dion's got cost, stigma, negative responses. Yes, good reasons there. Anyone else? They may feel they'll be denied services if they say they have a mental illness. Great, yes. What else? Mistrust of the system. That's a good one, Ashley. Fear, yes. It could be down to an individual experience, a family member experience, a community experience. It might be down to their immigration status. It might be down to stigmatizing views in the organization or the system that certain folks don't need the services as much as other subpopulations. There might be a lack of culturally competent organizations in that community. The homeless response system may not have found or cast a wide enough net to find differing organizations that serve other races or ethnicities. There might be a lack of culturally specific, for example, the LGBTQ population or the Latino population. And then there are some prominent prejudices. We all know that Black men end up in the criminal justice system rather than the behavioral health system in higher rates than other subpopulations. So, as Ashley said, mistrust of the system. As Dion said, stigma. As Damaris said, they may feel they'll be denied services if they say they have a mental illness. So we need to bear all of that in mind. And as a community, we need to be mindful of it and, of communicating around it. We need to think about who gets offered those services, why people accept or decline services, and hold that in an equitable lens. Okay, we're on to our last principle. If we do all of those things, we build a low barrier entry, we understand harm reduction, we give choices, we offer services, but we don't focus on social and community integration, we run the risk of people feeling alienated in their own home, feeling lonely and isolated there. And we need to understand that often people have lived in a homeless response system and it has become their home. It has become, it's where they meet their friends. It's where their safety network is. It's where they have all of their support services. And so in order for people to live independently in the community, we have to focus on social and community integration. And we do that with our case manager. And this is a hard practice to have, particularly for those of you who do PSH, because our tendency is to make the case manager the person who does everything. And where possible, we need case managers to be doing the services, the harm reduction, the social and community integration, and they need to be focusing on that provision only. Enforcing housing management within that, and I understand why we do it, because it's a lack of funding, damages relationships between the participant and the case manager. This is my last story, I promise. But I went to see a man called Jim, and Jim lived in his own apartment, and I've been seeing him for 3 years. And, I was very proud of the fact that Jim had stayed there for the last 3 years, because he did, up until then, he'd not had the greatest record of staying in housing. And so I knocked on the door, and I've got my coffee again. And Jim opens the door like this tiny crack, and he's going, "Yeah, what do you want?" And I said, "Come on, Jim, let me in." And he's like, "Oh, now's not a good time." I was like, "What's going on, Jim? Come on, we've been knowing each other for 3 years. Come on, let's talk about it." And so he kind of reluctantly opens the door, and I go in, and in the hallway there is a large hole in the plasterboard, and below that there is a chair in about 5 or 6 different pieces. And clearly Jim has lost his temper, and he's grabbed his chair and swung it against the wall a few times. And then Jim says three words that could have got me into such a difficult situation. He says, "Don't tell anyone." And I'm like, "Okay, Jim, all right, I'm not going to tell anyone, but we are going to talk about this all the time. And I'm not your housing manager, so I don't have to think about the consequences of this, but we do, and we need to think about what we're going to do about this." And in Jim's case, it took a number of sessions to think about that. And we talked about, could Jim fix it? Could Jim put a little money aside to fix it? Could the organization help Jim out and Jim could repay them? You know, what would be the consequences to the relationship with the landlord and to the housing manager? The one thing I do know is that if I'd said, Jim, yeah, I'm just going to have to write you a warning about, that's going to have to go on your record. I'm going to write you a warning. I don't know what the landlord's going to do. That's going to be so hard to persuade the landlord not to evict you, And this isn't the first time that something like this has happened. And then tried to pivot from that to, so Jim, how's it been around your drug use this week? That's not going to work. You can do one or the other. And I know that many systems ask us to do both, but if we can find a way, where one person focuses on the housing and one person focuses on the services, then we need to, that's the best way forward. So we should really, as a case manager, have two primary functions. All possible proactive strategies to keep the property are examined. And we need to be the advocate. And I can tell you, it is okay for you to have a big argument with the housing manager as part of your advocacy for people like Jim. Feelings should be heard. And it's okay to be, to be passionate about ensuring that people like Jim stay there. And I can tell you that the conversation I had with the manager, was passionate. And I sat there going, you don't understand. This is the very definition of success. He has stayed there for 3 years. He's doing better than he's ever done. And the housing manager was equally, no, you don't understand. I can't sort this out. This is the second time it's happened, and so finding a way forward on that. One of the ways we do that is to consider a written policy that says where we can help. And when I think about Housing First, I feel like it's a whole organization thing, not a case manager, because we often need money for housing, we need money for services, and we need money for people like Jim. And that's where I want my CEO out there rattling a tin and saying, we need that flexible pot of money that helps deal with issues where they're not related to housing and they're not related to services. Now, to a certain extent, Jim needs to take responsibility for the whole. We very much, Jim did take responsibility for that, and through the action plan that we all did together, we managed to figure everything out. But what is your agency prepared to do around damages, non-payment of rent, neighbor issues, all those kinds of things? And when it gets to arguments between me and the housing manager, and then that's where a good, strong, flexible, written policy will help you, because it will give you guidance on the way forward. You can't predict every possible outcome, but as many as we can, then that policy will really support us. Facing people in the community, I'd just touch on this. Some people may want to be placed in their traditional community. They may have roots, they may have, family or friends there. Others are going to say, literally, I can't go back to that area. That's literally where, the local drug dealer would sell me my stuff. I'm not going to, I need to go, I need a fresh start, I need a new place. And so as a case manager, it is our job to consider, whether it's a new place or an old place, how we build out that social and community integration. So we need to be thinking about a network of physical health resources. So physicians, dentists. Often people have been used to the idea of, well, I either go to a homeless specific resource or I use ER or somewhere like that. And so as we build out and our community integration, we need to think about what physical health resources, what mental health resources, what behavioral health resources there are for people. We also need to think about meaningful occupation. We want to avoid that isolation of people being in their apartment. So that might be work for some people, that might be volunteering for others, that might be, social activities or hobbies or cultural traditions, that might be going to day centers or day programs or recovery community organizations or recovery resources. So anything that, people can occupy their time with and build relationships and roots within the community is good. So we need to think about connecting with culturally sensitive resources. And something that I was relatively late to the party on is really the understanding around peer support and peer resources and how much those can support people. A strong peer support worker can say all kinds of things and do all kinds of things that I absolutely can't. And better than that, they can identify with and understand what people are going through in a way that, I can appreciate but never truly understand. And so ensuring that peer support workers are an integral part of, social system and integrating people into the community is critical. Okay, with just a few minutes left, I'm going to open it up for questions. You can ask me about the last couple of principles that we talked about. You can ask me about anything that we've talked about over the last hour and a half. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I'm curious to hear if you think I've missed anything or left anything out. I'm curious to know whether you've spent the last hour and a half just going like this, no, 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 or yes, yes, yes. What are your reactions? Go ahead, Karen. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just say definitely yes, yes, yes. And what's nice is Rhode Island is a housing first state, so it is the
Right.
philosophy and practice that we should all be using. And can I just add one more principle that Sam had in his book? Well, two actually. Housing is a basic right, so people don't have to write. And then second, he just always just drilled down the concept of respect, warmth, and compassion, and that is how we should be, not just with our clients, but with each other. And it is the philosophy. I mean, it is a housing first philosophy that we should all be trying to live. So anyway.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But yes, housing first is the way to go. It works, it's effective, and compared to the old model, that's 30% success rate, and this is 85. There really shouldn't even be a question at this point.
I am a huge fan. I've been living it and working it for many, many years. I won't tell you how many because that would age me. But, we know that it works. We know that, many people have done that. We also know that we need to resource it correctly in order for it to be successful. So,
well, that's the issue here is why we don't have the inventory. We are not able to put people immediately into housing. We do not have the housing. So that is our struggle here in Rhode Island is that, right, Zach, we don't have the housing to put people in. So we have to still live the principles and provide services as we're trying to house people, but we really don't have, we are so screwed right now with our housing inventory.
All right. If nobody has any questions, feel free. You can email me direct and I will send out the PowerPoint with my email on it. But thank you to everyone who participated in the webinar, particularly those of you that put stuff in the chat box. And I appreciate all your thoughts and ideas around it. And yeah, feel free to email me any direct questions and enjoy your weekend. Thank you, everyone. Bye.